Welcome. My name is Professor Aphra Kerr. I'm a professor in Maynooth University and also a researcher at the ADAPT Centre. I'm joined here today by three of our professors from ADAPT 2, Professor Owen Conlan from TCD, Professor John Kelleher from TU Dublin, and Professor Dave Lewis, also from TCD. The three professors I'm joined with here today are all strand leaders in ADAPT 2. And what we'd like to do in this session is spend a little bit of time talking through the research in the three strands and really building upon what Vinny has mentioned in the previous sessions. We're going to give some examples of how we collaborate with academics and external partners, and then finish with an overview of a vision for the future that incorporates some of the key work from ADAPT. There'll be an opportunity to ask live questions at the end, but also as you're listening to the video, you might want to add things into the chat that perhaps we can pick up on in the discussion at the end. So perhaps to kick us all off here, I'd like to just ask an opening question where we really have seen in the last year, I think, a really broad discussion around digital transformation more generally, partially driven by COVID, of course, but also a real searching for tools that can improve our work and living lives. We are seeing a need for digital transformation for people, for companies, and for governments. So how in ADAPT 2, from the research in your strand, how do you think we're going to address these emerging challenges and opportunities? And perhaps I'll go to you first, Owen, if you'd like to talk about the research in your strand.
Sure thing, Aphra. It's a very good question. I think the last year has really illustrated significant challenges that we're facing in new modes of activity, be that work, be it engaging with friends. And the research in the strand that I lead, which is entitled Digitally Enhanced Engagement, takes an individual perspective and very much looks at challenges of user modeling. What kind of information is it appropriate to gather about users to develop coherent models of what their activities actually are, what their preferences are, what they want to achieve. And then also looking at, well, when we get this view of a user, what can we do with it? Can we develop out some technologies that ultimately make life easier for us? So ease cognitive load. And this is something we talk about, is that we feel as we switch from meeting to meeting to meeting that you get bombarded with all of these things. And that's just your kind of your professional life. And what about all the other tasks that you want to try and achieve? Is there anything that the technologies we developed in ADAPT can do to help alleviate some of the difficulties that we're facing? And at the same time, ensure that we don't lose control. If we have technologies that are doing things on our behalf, how do we ensure that we have a balanced level of understanding what they're doing for us, managing and controlling that? And I suppose another key focus then is to find a balance between various different forms of immersion. So immersion in different experiences to ensure that we are appropriately and accurately engaged in those things. So I think some very interesting individual perspectives.
Can you give an example there of what you're talking about? A type of project, Owen?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the areas that we've been focusing on over the last few years, and one that we'll continue to focus on, is looking at incoming notifications as they arrive on a mobile device. And I think we've all found that you get an awful lot of noise there. They come in at the wrong time. They distract you out of what you're doing. Yet some of it might be pertinent or relevant to either your current task or something that you need to be aware of quite soon after you're completing your whatever you're doing at the moment. So having technologies that automatically uplift and understand what's going on there can possibly automatically respond to some of those items, not necessarily in your voice, so not necessarily pretending to be Owen if it's a message coming in for Owen, but to let the sender of that know that this will be actioned in some way, that some process is being kicked off to fulfill whatever that request is. And I think that's a small snapshot into what we can achieve as we expand out this idea of acting automatically on behalf of people.
And just before I move on, I wonder, are there any kind of projects you've been involved in with external partners where you could talk a little bit about working with an external partner on that type of project?
Yeah, so a good example of that very area is working with a large multinational company who had an interest in video processing. And you say, well, what does video processing have to do with incoming notifications? Well, from our perspective, a lot of it has to do with narrative and the story that's emerging across your life in notifications or across possibly a bit of video entertainment. and trying to synopsize that into a form that is succinct is appropriate for you and your understanding, because a synopsis of a video for you, for Dave, for me, may differ based on our interests, our background, the things that we would perceive as being important in that, and being able to draw out the meaningful signal out of multimedia content for an individual user is something that's very important. In the same way, you're trying to draw out the meaningful signal from a lot of incoming notifications. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think the key distinguishing aspect of our work is to engage users in that narrative, whether it's a pre-existing one or emerging, and that they're part of that, that they're in control of that.
Thanks, Owen. I might just move over to John now at this point, and Owen has talked about this individual level. John, I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the work of Adapt2 in the strand that you're involved in?
Yep. So I guess the strand that I'm leading and bring the perspective on from here could be characterized as developing and evaluating the underlying algorithms that might feed into the user models that Owen's group is looking at, and then more fundamentally into the broader enterprise and society systems and ecosystems that Dave's looking at. So within that idea, the strand is called Digital Content Transformation, the DCT strand, but primarily we're focused at that algorithmic level, the development and evaluation of them. And the types of tasks that we develop algorithms for are those underpinning content processing tasks, be it natural language processing, information extraction, machine translation, image processing, video processing. And that selection there is quite broad in the terms of the types of media it covers, and that's quite deliberate because we're trying to bring together expertise from all of these different universities in Ireland, all of these academics across all of these media to see what's the synergies that we can identify in that work. Within that, we have shared concerns in the solutions we're developing in terms of how we can support the user, whether that user be an individual or enterprise. And I think that's where we naturally link most directly with the research that Owen was talking about there, because they have that concept of the user model and they can bring the user into the picture, but we're trying to develop algorithms that can integrate with that research and user modeling, but how we have a slightly more of a focus on the algorithm prior to the user model coming in. And in particular, two kind of fundamental societal challenges or challenges that we believe both individuals and enterprise face in the modern setting is, on the one hand, information overload. You know, people who are seeking information just get barraged with so much information. So how do they choose what's relevant? But then on the other hand, which is, is digital exclusion. There are people who, we think that we're bringing everybody along and there's so much content out there for everybody. But if you're coming from a group in society that, let's say, speaks, doesn't speak the dominant language in a society, you can be excluded from the content that's available out there. So we're trying to work on both of those sides, the information overload and the complementary side of digital exclusion. So
can you give me an example there, John, of a concrete example of one of those projects, maybe around the language or that your strand has been working on?
So yeah, so on each of those sides of that coin, if you like. So if I was thinking about information overload, so I know I've been working in the last few months with a number of partners where we're bringing together expertise. And when I say me, it will be in collaboration with other academics, because we bring together this teams of academics who have expertise across a range of areas. So we've worked with a number of partners where we've integrated natural language processing with information extraction and with machine translation to develop solutions that help enterprises to manage the volume. For example, one example would be the volume of emails that are coming in. How do you improve the efficiencies of your operations in responding to emails so that you're more responsive to the information requests from your customers? But then on the other side, we're also looking at taking user-generated content from the web and trying to find out what signals there are there. Again, it can integrate those three different patterns of information extraction, natural language processing, and machine translation, often with, and I think one of the key strengths we have as well is bringing in really experienced data engineers to support the research academics so we can put together a solid data pipeline so that the solutions are, that they scale well. Again, that's dealing with helping enterprise and individuals just to filter through all of the information that they're receiving to find out what's relevant. And then on the other side, if we think about the digital exclusion, I know we're doing a lot of work on, for example, the Irish language and supporting the Irish language. And that's done through machine translation and developing digital solutions and digital resources to support the Irish language through that. But even beyond that, we also did research where, for example, we're developing domain-specific machine translation systems. So, for example, one of the challenges around machine translation is how do you deal with specific terminology? You might have a system that can, do a very good job of translating from French to English. They're both, by the way, I use those examples because they'd both be languages that would have a lot of digital resources, a lot of data around them, But there's challenges if they're, and that's in a general context. But challenges arise where you're dealing with machine translation, where maybe you're going to a language for which there isn't much digital content, or where there's a specific terminology. So some of the research we did recently on developing systems to translate public health advice. The reason I highlight public health advice is the specific terminology around COVID-19. How do you translate that and public health advice, for example, in Ireland for populations, subpopulations within Ireland who don't speak English, and how can we, in a rapid manner, develop systems that can include those people and provide those people with up-to-date public health advice that's accurate in a timely manner, so that they don't get excluded or marginalized within the discussions and within the care that the societies develop.
I think that's a good point, maybe to move on to Dave as we start to think maybe about the third strand of research. And Dave, maybe you'd like to introduce that to us.
Hi, thanks, Aphra. Yes, so I'm involved in a strand called transparent digital governance, and we're interested in the concerns in the similar sort of technological domains, obviously, that you've heard from Owen and John, but focusing specifically on the role of the enterprises that are engaged in adopting, rolling out these technologies, and their interaction with some broader societal concerns. So that involves, both understanding how the expectations for how these technologies work once they're released into the market or brought into service, how those public expectations can be captured and conveyed to enterprises. But also enterprises are interested in this, obviously, because they're one of the biggest challenges they face is building public trust in a lot of the technologies they use, especially technologies that are heavily based on the collection and processing of personal data. So, in looking at this, we take a multidisciplinary approach. So we collaborate not only with computer scientists, but also legal scholars and ethicists, social scientists. And we also take a very sort of data focused point of view, because a lot of the technologies that we're looking at across Adapter are data-driven forms of artificial intelligence primarily, and therefore focusing on how we govern the data. So how do we ensure that it's good quality? Is it correct? Is it covering the right sort of population? But also, are we addressing that with appropriate attention to ethics? So again, reflecting the expectations society has on how organizations manage that data and implement it in technology. Looking at the legal aspects of this, we're in a very interesting period. We've all become very used to the implications of the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been enforced for a couple of years now. But there's a whole raft of other regulations coming through related to data governance, related to AI, related to different aspects of the digital market in Europe that are going to start imposing themselves on our lives also, and companies and organizations of all types are interested in how they adapt their data governance processes to that. including issues around, understanding the value of the data that they're holding, understanding the risks and liabilities they have by, collecting and manipulating that data.
This strand has somewhat expanded, shall we say, from Adapt 1. There's a lot of elements that are new, so you may not have quite as many use cases, Dave. Yeah. But I wonder, would you point to something that our audience here might be particularly interested in, that you're working on, or that gives a good concrete example?
Yeah, well, one domain that I think has been very rich in terms of research use cases, the health domain. So we working with some colleagues who are both medics, medical researchers, but also other computer scientists who've been working for a long time in the areas of electronic patient health records, and that throws up a lot of recurring challenges, because we tend to be dealing with very sensitive personal data that we're collecting, people's health information, but also trying to undertake either research or possibly product development that can leverage that data but use it in a way that's very much holding the public trust at its center. Okay, so one example there is work that we've collaborated on in studying vasculitis, which is a sort of a chronic condition that causes, to do with one's immune system and kidneys, and it can sort of flare up in quite unpredictable ways. So we've been looking at ways that we can collect the right data together, so we can actually try and analyze and build correlations between different factors in people's lives. So that's their medical records, but also, there may be environmental or pollution aspects to this. So, we correlate that with location information, with weather and pollution information that we can obtain from public sources, and also self-reported information as well. So, in this case, we have an app that people can, record how they're feeling, and these sort of applications obviously have appeared in front of us through COVID as well, where we have the COVID app, which asks, both as a way of tracking how we, our status in terms of, whether we're well or not, who we've been close to, but also, how we're feeling at any one time, what our symptoms are. And this actually gets more complicated now as we're looking to perhaps travel and use some of this information with our COVID passports also.
So if I was to, thank you everyone. I think that's a nice overview of the three strands. I'd like us now to kind of think about the fact that, of course, Adapt 2 will run for 6 years. It has a nice long time frame. We're already starting to think about what comes beyond that, what goes on beyond that. And I think we have a clear vision in Adapt of a kind of human-centric, AI-supported future, rather, and looking at how we can support people. But there's a range of opportunities now, I think, for our audience here to engage and collaborate and help us to share our agenda, to come to talk to us about things they're interested in working on, and for members of the centre to talk to them about that. I wonder if I could go to you, Owen, to talk a little bit about this vision we have in Adapt 2 and the possibilities for our partners and our audience to maybe engage with us.
Yeah, certainly. So when I think about Adapt, I think about our tagline, actually, simply, and you can kind of see it above our shoulders here: engaging content, engaging people. And of course, there are nice little ambiguities in that. And if we project forward for the next 6, 7, 10 years, I think there's very significant change coming, and Adapt is helping to drive that change. So let's think about what some of those aspects might be. For me, one of the most significant things that's coming down the line is trying to mitigate all of the small, tedious, intensive tasks that we perform that just suck time out of our day, whether that's our personal life or our professional life. So think about the amount of time we spend searching for information, the amount of time we spend filtering it, trying to make sense of it, and piece together stories that maybe have been pieced together by others or maybe haven't. What technologies can help with that? So I think there's a proactive opportunity to anticipate our needs and draw in all of that information that may be of use to us, but then place a narrative across it. So it's a word I've used before, so that it's something that is easier for us to understand, absorb, and process. And for me, that's very much requires an understanding of the human, what our tasks, our trajectories, our goals, our needs are, and bring that in. And for me, that's the first step, because that's still something that's quite similar to what we try to achieve with a lot of personalization and have been doing for the last 20 years, where we focus on the person, where we're delivering to this thread of consciousness, our ability to understand information and absorb it. But what happens when we get a good enough model of the user that we can start doing things on their behalf? And I hinted at this earlier. So what happens if we can automatically respond to some of those notifications? And let's push that forward. Let's push that into a more extreme situation. So let's project out 10 years' time. And let's decide that in 10 years' time, I'm very busy, which isn't much of a change, right? But like many of us here, there might be too busy. There are too many things for you to attend to. Can you take a proactive agent that has a sufficiently deep understanding of you and ask that agent to do increasingly complex things? What would happen if we had an agent that could attend a Zoom meeting on our behalf, that would have a sufficient base of knowledge to be able to represent some of our baseline interests, would be drawing in information from that meeting, using that same kind of idea earlier of succinctly summarizing it for our needs later on. And it may be able to offer certain responses in that context. And what are the fidelity challenges there? So the fidelity of representation, maybe of the visual, of the voice, of the gestures. These are all aspects of immersion that, by projecting to that slightly extreme situation, you start to look at a whole suite of other things that these proactive agents could do on our behalf. And I very much see the future as being multi-threaded, that we are no longer the sole actor. And I mean that specifically that word act, that we can have these agents act on our behalf. But of course, that leads to challenges around control, management, agency. What does it mean if you're a human interacting with one of these agents that somebody else has sent? And this is, I think, quite visionary. I think it's often quite challenging, and it's challenging on multiple perspectives, from the algorithmic, of course, from the societal, the ethical, and I think it offers a really interesting landscape to explore the extent to which these agents may function.
So that's a challenging as well as exciting vision for the future. I wonder if John and Dave, there's anything you'd like to point to there, because obviously when it comes to AI, it also raises other questions for us. And John, you've mentioned kind of exclusion and inclusion, and Dave, you've kind of mentioned the responsibilities and the kind of legal and other areas. So John and Dave, is there anything you'd like to add to the kind of future vision that Owen has laid out for us?
Well, one of the things I'm very excited about in the vision, so apart from the three kind of pillar strands we've been talking about here, that the algorithmic level that I'm kind of speaking for today, Owen speaking for the user-centric, and then the user modeling, and Dave for the enterprise and society, we have these cross-cutting strands of research that goes across these three themes. And one of those is attentive AI that I'm very excited about, which is it picks up on what Owen was talking about there in terms of notifications, but it's that idea of developing systems that are capable of understanding the context that you're acting in, or that they are acting in as well. So a sense of self-reflexivity within the systems, so that they understand that they're able to recognize what is relevant to attend to, and in that way, in that context, and that way minimize the amount of data they use. So that attentive AI, big picture, could be understood as AI that minimizes its data use and minimizes its footprint. And I think that's exciting from a number of perspectives. One is from a privacy perspective, individual privacy. But another area that I'm very excited about is the idea of reducing the carbon footprint associated with artificial intelligence and data-driven systems. That's a growing problem. So sustainable AI, and that's both, and I think that attentive AI, that idea of minimizing the amount of data, making our models smaller, smarter in a sense, feeds into that longer term picture, both of AI for sustainability, but before we can use AI to improve sustainability, we also have to improve the sustainability of AI. So that's making the model smaller and less data hungry. So that's one area I'd be very excited about pushing
Yeah,
forward.
that seems to be crucial in the current agenda, national and European levels. Dave, have you anything to add here to the vision part?
Yeah, certainly, because I think what's really interesting is, as with a lot of our technologies, we're focusing on the benefits often to the individual, making our life in our digital world easier and more productive. But obviously that involves collecting more and more data about us as individuals. And I think, people in general are understanding, more of the risks, or more that there are risks there, but perhaps not understanding what those risks are. And we're asked on a daily basis to make decisions about that when we sort of press these little consent boxes on cookies. And you can argue we're actually not very well equipped to make those decisions at all. And we can see more regulation coming down the pipeline that may put similar pressures on individuals. And I think there's a really rich opportunity here for both, organizations and enterprises to collaborate with, their users in more of a collective way. So, finding fora by which you can explore some of these issues and try and be a bit more agile in how you understand what the expectations of your users are, and have that as a reliable part of your engagement with organizations, that users can come together, debate this and debate some of these issues and perhaps provide some guidelines. Because I think there's many things that perhaps don't do some big harm to us individually or in a way that we can detect or are understandable, but when we look at it collectively, we perhaps have a better understanding of what that harm is and what we could do about that. And I think this is especially important, not just from a societal point of view in terms of people having a bit more of a say over how these technologies are developed, but also companies. Companies are being regulated more. They're going to see more regulation, and their engagement in that is driven by the fact that hopefully that will help build trust between them and their users. Whereas if it's not done well, if it's not done with the right voices and debate in the right places, they can still be subject to regulation and still not be trusted by their users. So we have to find the sort of the sweet spot, the win-win situation in these circumstances.
So just as we move to the last couple of minutes now, I wonder if I could ask you all if you have a final thought or to wrap up and kind of lead us into the next sessions and discussions. Owen, I'll start with you again. Is there just one kind of final example or thought you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I think the thought I'd like to offer is I think we're seeing a transformation in how users understand their data, what's being gathered about them, and also their rights and opportunities around that. And I'm not speaking so much from a regulatory perspective, which Dave would focus on. I'm thinking much more in the side of, the model minimization. So to reduce, as John was saying, this attentive side, and reduce the amount of data that's being gathered, but also offering users opportunities around their own data and for them to curate it, change it, say, no, actually, you've modeled this incorrectly because you're only getting a partial view of me. I think we're starting to see that growing understanding from users, that if they can interact with some of what happens under the hoods, and they can scrutinize what happens in some of our systems, that small tweaks and controls can lead to a much better experience for them. So for me, I think we're seeing this change that people don't want to be just passengers in our services that we offer them. They want to have a little bit more active control. But of course, we need to figure out how to do that in such a way that we don't overload them.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, I pick up on that theme as well. So on the one side, where I was talking earlier about the attentive AI and the minimizing the systems, we have this other aspect of drivable AI for the users in control. And that for us when we're designing algorithms, trying to make an algorithm that is adjustable by a user and its outputs are adjustable by a user, I think is really exciting. So I know we're doing some work at the moment, for example, and a lot of my examples earlier might have focused on the analysis of content, but we also have a lot of work that works at the generation of content, and the transformation of content. So to try and balance that out, for example, we have work ongoing on image captioning and video captioning, but any particular image, there's multiple different types of captions you could have for that image, depending on the user's context and their user needs. So in that theme of trying to make it drivable and tailoring it, we're developing algorithms where people can put their inputs into, okay, I want a caption for this image, but I want this type of caption or that type of caption. And that's a first step down that line where the user has explicit control of the system, where they're driving the AI rather than the AI driving them. So that would be the other area I'd like to highlight towards the end. Yeah.
Thank you. And Dave, just final thoughts maybe from you?
I think it's interesting again to sort of, reflect on this. I wouldn't even say it's a wave, it's more like a tsunami of regulations that's coming down the road to us. And I think with a fair degree more complexity, not in the sort of regulation by itself, but its interaction with other regulations. So the new AI regulation is very much taking a health and safety and risk management approach, and it refers both on the one hand to lots of other regulations that are already out there, but it also has a big dependency on international standards. Now, we've been very active in international standards around trustworthy AI, but again, also have a very acute view of the level of detail they do give you and the level of detail that they don't give you. So I think there's a lot of work to go on there, and that does need a really active collaboration between sort of government, citizen representation, researchers, and companies who are going to be, at the end of the day, implementing these technologies and implementing the regulations as well.
Well, thank you. I think that's been a really nice overview of the 3 different strands. So thank you for sharing your insights and really looking into what we're looking at in ADAPT 2 for the next few years and even down the road. Now, we're going to take some questions after this session, as you know, and I'll just invite the audience to put their questions into the Q&A section below. And I'd like to thank you all for your time. Thank you.